Hey, this is the 80s Slasher Librarian, just letting you guys know if you enjoy the content here on the channel and want to support the channel, click on the Patreon link in the description below. As I'm not allowed to monetize the channel here on YouTube, I depend on you guys to keep this channel going and growing by becoming patrons of the channel and sponsoring at the Patreon page. There's great rewards for doing so in tiers as low as $2 to $5 per month. Enjoy tonight's upload of Halloween, guys. Thanks. Halloween, Chapter 5. On the evening of October 30th, 1978, a new Buick station wagon sliced through the blackness of a rainy night on State Highway 116, heading east toward the Smiths Grove State Facility. On the front door of the sleek car was the institution's emblem. The only other thing that distinguished it from an ordinary car was the chicken wire grating that separated the front and back seats. Inside, her face illuminated by the eerie glow of the dashboard and the occasional orange light of her passengers' nervously puffed cigarettes, Marion Treadwell Arian peered into the jet night. She wore a crisply starched white nurse's uniform and hat and a navy cape with red piping around her shoulders. Her knuckles on the steering wheel were white, as if she weren't nervous enough about tonight's assignment. The foul weather made her as uptight as a drug addict looking for a score. As her passenger smoked and talked, Marion resisted the temptation to look at him. She'd heard so much about Dr. Loomis, both good and bad, and after glimpsing him when she'd picked him up in front of his home, she could see why he was spoken of with that mixture of reverence and dread that people reserved for Rasputin. His head was shaved bald, but he wore a gray goatee, giving him a slightly diabolical appearance. He dressed in a limp, wrinkled brown suit and not very rain-proof trench coat, and apparently gave no heed whatever to the conventions of good dress. His crystal blue eyes were awesome in their intensity, and you knew at once that mundane matters like proper attire were beneath the interest of a man with such eyes. In his lap he held a manila folder, whose notes he tried to follow with his index finger in the light emanating from the dashboard. Then he gets another physical examination by the state, followed by an appearance before the judge. Bear in mind that this is not the judge of the juvenile court, because the subject is no longer a minor. In any case, the procedure should take 4 hours if we're lucky. Then we're on our way. As before, he will be heavily sedated. What did you use before? Thorazine. The driver frowned. Why, he'll barely be able to sit up. Loomis smiled grimly. That's the idea. Here we are. He gestured towards a large, white sign fixed to a low brick wall on the left. It said, Smiths Grove, Warren County Sanitarium. Through the blackness and the downpour, she could make out the shadowy mass of the institution looming up on the hillside, surrounded by a sturdy steel fence above which ran 3 strips of no-nonsense barbed wire. The driveway's up a few hundred yards on your right, Loomis indicating, gesturing with his cigarette. The nurse, an attractive redhead, was slightly disappointed that Loomis hadn't asked her anything about herself. She guided the station wagon around the approach road. Loomis's indication that he intended to keep their charge drugged was typical of the rumors she'd heard about this rugged-jawed, single-minded man. It was said that the patients he treated successfully returned to the world completely adjusted and capable of leading normal lives. It was also said that those he thought incapable of recovery, he sedated until they were no more dangerous than a row of string beans. "Are there any special instructions?" she asked. For the first time, he looked at her directly. "Just try to understand what we're dealing with here. Don't underestimate it." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't you think we should refer to it as him?" Loomis shrugged. "If you say so," he said without conviction. "Your compassion is overwhelming, Doctor," she said, reaching for a pack of cigarettes. She took one out and slipped it between her full lips. Then she groped for her matches. Loomis reached into his coat for his lighter, but she found her matches first and lit her own cigarette. Now Loomis did look at her for the first time, noting the sheen of her auburn hair, the high cheekbones, the pert nose, as the flare of the match momentarily illuminated her attractive features. She put the matches up on the dashboard, but they slipped off as the car lurched to the right. Loomis picked them up off the carpeted floor. They said, "The Rabbit in Red Lounge, Entertainment Nightly." An odd name, he thought, and wondered whether the young lady frequented the place and what sort of entertainment one might be fortunate enough to see there. "Ever done anything like this before?" he asked. "Only minimum security." "I see," he said, failing to keep the pity out of his voice. "What does that mean?" she said defensively, picking up his tone. "It means..." He gazed at her, assessing her maturity and concluding she didn't have too much of it. "It means I see, that's all." "You don't have to make this any harder than it already is," she said forthrightly. Loomis's smile was devoid of humor. "I couldn't if I tried." "The only thing that bothers me is their gibberish. When they start raving on and on." She finished the thought with a shiver and a look of disgust. "You don't have to worry about that," said Loomis. He's scarcely spoken a word in years. Suddenly, in the middle distance, the car's headlights detected a ghostly shape about 25 yards away. Loomis leaned forward and peered, eyebrows knit in dismay. Something is wrong. Marion lifted her foot from the gas pedal and hovered it over the brake, awaiting instructions as she squinted through the windshield into the troubled night. The wraith-like figure had momentarily disappeared. Then 5 of them appeared. Patients clad in wind-blown, rain-soaked white gowns, wandering or cavorting around the field outside the fence. Their eyes were hollow and almost zombie-like, their faces ravaged by decades of incarceration. "Since when do they let them wander around?" Marion asked cynically. "They don't," Loomis replied unnecessarily, gesturing impatiently for her to drive the rest of the way to the gate, where there was a telephone. "Drive! Drive!" A figure stepped in front of them, a male patient with an insane grin and red-rimmed eyes. Marion had to stop the car to avoid running him over. Loomis thrust open his door and jumped out. He trotted over to the bewildered escapee and asked him a question. The man gesticulated with wild, gnarled hands. Loomis's eyes clouded with fear. He rushed back to the car and hopped in, rivulets of rain trickling down his bald head into his face and beard. "Pull up to the entrance!" "Shouldn't we pick him up?" "Move it!" Marion pressed the gas pedal. The rear tires whined on the wet pavement, then grabbed. The powerful car almost knocked the hapless inmate down. "What did he say?" "He asked me if I could help him find his purple lawnmower." "I don't think this is any time to be funny," Marion declared indignantly. "After all,
He said something else," Loomis said ominously. "He said, it's all right now. He's gone. The evil's gone."
They exchanged a serious look.
"What does that mean?"
"Wait here," he said, leaping out of the still-rolling car and rushing to the guard booth. He slid the door open and stepped on something soft. He knelt over it. It was the guard. His head was twisted on his neck as if some giant hand had tried to unscrew it. The man's eyes bulged hideously
and his tongue lolled over bloody lips. "My God," Loomis gasped as he reached for the phone. Inside the car, Marion drew nervously on her cigarette as the escaped inmates did their dance macabre around the parking lot. The driving rain drummed on the roof and hood, and Loomis's contorted face in the guard booth as he shouted his message to the main house did not make her feel any easier. All at once there was a tremendous thump on the roof, which buckled momentarily before popping back into shape. Marion glimpsed a flutter of white cloth out of the corner of her eye and realized what it was. "Oh no, one of them is on the roof of the car," she muttered, rolling the window on the driver's side down to plead with the inmate to get down. The noise on the roof was unimaginable, like someone dancing on it. Marion stuck her head out of the window. "Okay, that'll be enough." She did not see the powerful hand extending from the roof, but a moment later it had her by the hair and was attempting to pull her through the window. When the intruder realized he couldn't do that, he attempted to get a grip on her jaw to twist her head off. For a moment she shrieked with helpless panic, but Loomis either didn't see what was happening or couldn't help. There was only one solution before this monstrous hand snapped her neck. She groped desperately for the knob of the window and found it after what seemed an eternity. She gave it a quarter turn with her free hand, but the problem was that her head was out the window, and the man's grip was too strong for her to pull back inside of the car. Frantically, she clawed at the hand. A finger passed over her open, screaming mouth. She clamped her teeth on it with all of her might. The thing let out an inhuman howl and momentarily relaxed its grip. She yanked her head back inside and closed the window on his hand. He roared again and pulled his hand out of the window before her last turn on the knob clamped him irrevocably. Marion clutched at her throat and begged for air. She was momentarily safe, but an instant later, she had her hands full at the window on the passenger side. The inmate, still on the roof, had stuck the window with shattering force, and the window's protective glass had cracked into 1,000 geometric splinters that adhered to each other for the moment, but would fly into the car the next time he hit it. The thing peered upside down into the car, and Marion saw a ghastly rain-soaked creature, made even more horrible by the spiderweb pattern of the cracked window. Now, in blind panic, she stepped full on the gas pedal. The tires keened on the wet pavement, then took hold and the car lurched forward. Marion tore around sharply from left to right to left again. The car swayed and skidded, but the thing, clinging to the windshield wiper and a door handle, somehow managed to hold on. The rain cascaded down the windshield, and she couldn't see a thing. She certainly didn't see the parking lot curb when she struck it at 40 miles an hour. The wheel tore out of her hand and her chin struck the rim. The station wagon spun wildly out of control, hurling her across the seat to the passenger side. Then it struck another curb broadside, and from that moment on, Marion remembered nothing until she was being helped to her feet by Loomis. She lay on the soaked grass of an embankment, a violent ringing in her ears. The nerves in her scalp throbbed from the pain of her hair having been violently pulled. About a dozen paces away, the station wagon sat, idling. Loomis examined her and satisfied himself that she'd suffered no serious harm. Then he turned to the car. "Good God, there's someone in there!" He could see the ghostly shape on the driver's side, and it seemed to be frantically pounding on the steering wheel, as if trying to make the thing go. Loomis dashed for the car, but just as he reached it, it vaulted forward, careering crazily from side to side until the driver seemed to gain mastery of the controls and roared down the road and onto the highway. Loomis returned to Marion, who was sobbing hysterically and shuddering from the rain and cold. Pulling her cloak closer around her shoulders, he held her tightly. Together they watched the taillights of the station wagon fade into the blackness of the Illinois night. Then he turned to her. "You can calm down now. The evil is gone." Somehow, she took no comfort in that at all.
Chapter 6. Laurie Strode stepped out of the door of the white frame house on Oak Street and sniffed the air. It was cool and tangy with a faint touch of wood smoke. Someone had lit a fire in a fireplace somewhere down the street, and for Laurie it had a special significance. It marked in her own mind the official start of winter. Of course, winter didn't truly begin until the third week in December, a little less than 2 months away. And you couldn't ask for a more autumnal event than Halloween, which took place this very night. Nevertheless, Laurie thought about winter, and felt that same mixture of eagerness and dread that most Midwesterners feel about the season. She was a pretty girl, slim and angular, with straight brown hair falling without fanfare to her shoulders. Farrah hairstyles were all the rage, but Laurie thought it was an affection and a pain in the ass to keep up. Though not exactly a bookworm, she had decided there were simply too many more interesting things to do, like reading, than to spend all that time washing, blow-drying, teasing, and combing, to say nothing of dyeing or frosting your hair, if you really wanted to do that trip the right way. She dressed in simple school attire, a print skirt, knee socks, sensible shoes, and a boy's shirt under a sweater. Loaded down under 2 heavy book bags, she appeared to be round-shouldered and flat-chested, but that didn't worry her. She knew that when she set out to dress and make up for a date, she could hold her own with anybody in her high school class. But today was a school day, and there is no way you can look glamorous on a school day, short of getting your own private porter or chauffeur to carry you and your books to school. So you do the best you can, and if your friends tease you about it, and about your waddle, you grin and bear it. She was slightly surprised to note several younger children already dressed in Halloween costumes. Then she realized they were not trick-or-treating at 8 in the morning, but merely dressed up for Halloween parties at school. Her cool blue eyes warmed as 2 little 6-year-old girls with eminently solemn faces glided by in satin gowns and rhinestone tiaras, turning occasionally to bark warnings to the gruff little pirates and cowboys who teased them 10 paces behind. She wasn't sure if one of the boys was Tommy Doyle, for whom she was to babysit tonight. Babysitting. Number 1 boring job. Boring! Some of her girlfriends used babysitting as a means for making out. Perhaps if Laurie were interested in somebody, she might do the same thing. But there wasn't anyone in her life right now, so it looked like she would be spending another evening supervising Tommy's addiction to horror movies and satisfying his craving. And she admitted her own for popcorn. She thought about what her girlfriends did with their dates on babysitting jobs. Some of them had confessed, even boasted, that they went all the way with their boyfriends. Laurie wasn't inexperienced, and she wasn't a prude either. But she knew herself well enough to understand she wouldn't be able to handle that trip at the tender age of 17. In fact, she sometimes wondered if there was something wrong with her, if she was a little retarded or something. The smoldering fires of adolescence had never really tortured her body the way it did some of her friends, like Annie, for instance. And although almost everybody in her class smoked grass, she not only had never gotten high, she couldn't draw the smoke into her lungs without coughing. And she was too smart to be interested in any other kind of drug. "Laurie, Laurie," she said under her breath, shaking her head morosely. "At this rate you'll end up to be as sensible as your mother. What a drag." "What are you dreaming about, sweetheart?" came her father's voice from behind. Chester Strode stood on the front doorstep, fooling with a key ring. "Oh, the usual, sex and drugs," she laughed, knowing he wouldn't take her seriously. "Thank goodness," he said. "I was worried you were ODing on English Lit and political science." "No danger of that," she retorted. "My parents brought me up to be a straight and decent kid." They walked together to his car, a black sedan with Strode Real Estate emblazoned in bold red and white on the door. It never failed to embarrass her, this advertisement glaring at people wherever they drove. Maybe things like this were done in Cleveland or Chicago or St. Louis, but in a small town like Haddonfield, most people kept a low profile. Oh well, it brought Daddy business, and as her father was fond of pointing out, business meant food and clothes and a college education, so she couldn't really complain.
They stood beside the car for a moment until her father managed to slide the proper key off his ring, which had so many keys on it. He called it his occupational affliction. He looked like a jailer handing a simple brass key to her and said, "Now don't forget to drop this off at the Myers place." "I won't," she said. She decided to keep it in her hand instead of dropping it into her book bag, where it would be out of sight, out of mind. "They're coming to see the house at 10:30. Be sure you leave it under the mat." "I promise." She started to walk away. "Haven't you forgotten something?" he called after her. He stood by the car, head tilted, exposing his freshly shaved cheek. Lori walked back and put her lips hastily to his cheek, hoping none of her girlfriends were watching, then feeling guilty immediately afterward. Why should a girl be embarrassed about kissing her own father, for crying out loud? She set out down Oak Street, rolling slightly from side to side with the weight of her books, the famous Lori waddle. In her right hand the key to the Myers house seemed to tingle, and suddenly she found herself thinking about the house. It was the one property her father handled that he was ashamed to speak of, and his relief at unloading it for once far outweighed his profit motive. For this was the house in which a 17-year-old girl had been brutally slain by her little brother 15 years ago. The Myers had moved away a few months after the tragedy. The grief, shame, and harassment by the press and gawking neighbors and passers-by had made their lives in Haddonfield intolerable. From somewhere in Indiana they continued to pay their mortgage, loan, and taxes, which, as Lori's father had often said, was a terrible double burden. Not only could they not find a buyer all those years, but they had to bear the emotional burden every time they wrote out a check to support the unsellable house. Chester Strode had used every trick in his little salesman bag to sell the white turkey, as he'd come to call it. But as soon as prospective buyers heard about the events of October 31st, 1963, from neighbors all too eager to tell them, their superstition invariably got the best of them, and it was goodbye sell. Mr. Strode couldn't even persuade customers to buy the property for the value of the land. "Buy it and raise the house if that's the way you feel," he would tell them, but the property was tainted and no one went for the bait. Thank God for the New York couple who thought the house was just what they were looking for, and who were too sophisticated to believe the nonsense the neighbors prattled about. In fact, the New York couple actually thought the idea of a haunted house was charming, something they could boast about. So Mr. Strode gave the New Yorkers something else they could boast about, a price so ridiculous it was, to use his patented phrase, lower than a song. Lori wondered what it must have been like that night for the Myers girl, seeing her tiny brother coming at her with that enormous butcher knife. Imagine a blade that long going into her stomach, her chest, even her, it was unspeakable, unthinkable. "Hey, Lori!" Rarely had she been so relieved to be pulled out of a fantasy. The caller was Tommy Doyle, the boy she was sitting for tonight. The 8-year-old with tousled brown hair and bright eyes trotted up to her, swinging 2 or 3 books strapped together with a belt. Lori, whose own load of books qualified her to join the Stevedores Union, sighed at this symbol of vanishing youth. "Hi, Tommy." He caught up with her, and they walked side by side for several paces. "Are you coming over tonight?" "Same time, same place." "Can we make jack-o'-lanterns?" "Sure." "Can we watch monster movies?" "Sure." "Will you read to me? Can we make popcorn?" "Sure." Her answers came absently and automatically. They were the same questions every time. But this time she was thinking about poor Judith Myers as they turned the corner and walked the 100 paces into Peacher Street where the Myers house was. She couldn't purge her mind of that awful picture of a knife, a long silvery knife, flashing through the air and plunging into her body. A knife wielded by Tommy, how old are you again?" They had stopped abruptly, and Lori was staring at the boy. "You know how old I am. I'm 8. Why?" She hesitated, not wanting to put murderous thoughts into the head of the kid she was sitting for tonight.
Yet there was something she had to know. "Have you ever felt like killing somebody?" The boy shrugged. "Sure." "You have?" "Sure, hasn't everybody?" "They have?" Her eyes bulged. "Sure. When somebody takes something away from you, or your parents tell you you can't have something, or, the teacher gives you too much homework, you feel like killing them. Is that what you mean?" Well, oh, that's what you mean," Tommy said, eyes rounding and the color draining from his face. They had arrived at the Myers house. It was a ghost of its former self, weather-beaten and dilapidated. Set back from the street 20 or 25 paces, it stood glowering in the cool autumn morning like some mangy, brooding beast. Its former spanking coat of white paint, the symbol of pride of every fine Midwestern home, had turned a dingy gray, and much of it had peeled or flaked off, revealing a pitted and rotting facade of shingles. Several windows had been broken by kids or vandals, a few of whom had been bold enough to scrawl graffiti on the front door. A huge elm beat against an upstairs window as the breeze stiffened. "You're not supposed to go up there," the kid said, freezing to the spot. Lori flourished the key. "Yes, I am." That's a spook house." "Just watch," she said, walking coolly up to the porch. She lifted the welcome mat as her father had instructed, and placed the key under it. She had wanted Tommy to know how unafraid she was. But if she was so unafraid, why was her hand damp with perspiration as she pulled it back from the mat? For a moment she stood transfixed, contemplating that night 15 years ago. My God, 15 years ago to the very night, she realized, when the tragic event had taken place. She vaguely heard Tommy on the sidewalk pleading with her to get away from there, but the horror of it attracted her in some perverse way. Was it the fascination of the innocent with wickedness, or just some sort of sick curiosity? Or was she herself capable of the same gruesome deed? She shut her eyes and imagined herself picking up a butcher knife and plunging it into the breast of whom? Whom did she loathe so much she would want to do that to? To someone in your own family, for God's sake. She couldn't think of a soul. "Lori, please, I'm getting scared," the boy was whining. "So am I," she laughed with a shudder, trotting down the porch steps and joining her young companion. And as she turned her back on the house, a figure inside it, dark, shadowy, sidled up to the front door and pushed the tattered curtain aside with a knuckle. He watched the slim blonde toss her head and laugh as she raised her hands like a boogeyman to frighten her young companion. He breathed heavily, raspingly, as he watched the girl, and a memory entered his mind. The memory of another girl, another blonde, willowy and pretty. He remembered the trapped and frightened look in her eyes and the futile, pathetic way she had raised her hands to protect herself. He followed the girl and boy with his gaze until they disappeared from view. Then he walked up the creaky stairs to the second floor and peered into the room where it had all happened. "I thought you liked to be scared," Lori teased Tommy. "God knows you groove on horror movies enough." "Yeah, but those are movies. You can always turn the television off if you get too scared. You can't turn off real life." "That's very wise, Tommy." "Lonnie Elam said never to go up there. Lonnie Elam said it's a haunted house. He told me about some real awful stuff that happened there once." "Lonnie Elam probably won't get out of 3rd grade. "I gotta go. I'll see you tonight," Tommy said, breaking away. "See you." She paused on the corner, feeling odd, as if someone was boring into the back of her head. She turned and gazed back at the Myers house. She could just make out the gable of the bedroom where Judith Myers had been killed. Her eyebrows knit. Was she crazy, or was there a shape standing in the window, staring at her? She rubbed her eyes and looked again. No, there was nothing there after all. Her imagination was working overtime again. She pivoted and continued down the street to school, trying to stride smartly but rolling with the slight waddle that everybody knew belonged uniquely to Laurie Strode. Chapter 7. Sam Loomis strode down the steps of the institution, gesturing to the sky as if invoking the Almighty to help the fool beside him understand. The other man, gray-haired and ashen-faced, shrank before Loomis's wrath. "I'm not responsible, Sam," Dr. Wynne pleaded unconvincingly. "Of course not." "I've given them his profile." Loomis stopped in his tracks and stared at the sanitarium's chief administrator. "You gave them the profile of a village idiot, not a homicidal maniac. 2 roadblocks and an all-points bulletin wouldn't stop a 5-year-old. He all but ran back to his car, again hurling imprecations to the sky. "I sometimes wonder who needs shock treatments more, the patients or the staff." "He was your patient, Doctor," Wynne argued half-heartedly as Loomis unlocked his car. "If the precautions weren't sufficient, Loomis, you should have notified." "I notified everybody. You have a file on that man 6 inches thick. Either you didn't read those things or you can't. Oh, God, save me. Save me from these bureaucrats." He slipped quickly into the car and fumbled for his keys. "There's nothing I can do," the hapless Wynne said. "That's certain. You did nothing before. Why should you be able to do anything now? How about getting on the telephone and telling them exactly what got out of here last night? And you tell them where he's going." "We don't know what got out of here last night. Your 6-inch thick file is full of conjecture. As for where he's going, Loomis, that's conjecture too." "You call that God's broken neck conjecture? Tell that to his widow. You call the assault on the nurse conjecture? He pulled half the hair out of her scalp, for Christ's sake." "The police will catch him." "If they look for him in Haddonfield, they might." Wynne flashed a patronizing smile that enraged Loomis even more. "Sam, Haddonfield is 150 miles from here. How could he get there? He can't drive." "He was doing all right last night. Maybe somebody around here gave him lessons. If you read the file, then you would know that he had the run of the place. Inmates and staff alike were scared to death of him, and indulged his every wish. Someone could very well have taught him how to drive." That's preposterous. If he had such freedom, why didn't he walk out of here years ago?" "Because he had it made here. He had his little empire." Wynne shook his head and rolled his eyes heavenward, as exasperated with Loomis as Loomis was with him. "Then why did he take off from here all of a sudden?" "Because." Loomis had a strong idea why, for the same reason why he was probably heading for Haddonfield. But if Wynne hadn't bought any of Loomis's explanations up to now, he sure as hell wouldn't accept any now. "I don't know why," Loomis snapped. "Why don't you announce this to the press?" "You know why." Loomis clapped his hand to his head. "Yes, it looks bad, but for the hospital. You're willing to let a butcher roam the countryside so you can save your job. Oh, God, save me from bureaucrats," he repeated more fervently. He started the car and rolled down the window. "I tell you this, Dr. Wynne, when the bodies start turning up, your job won't be worth an orderly's salary. You'll be lucky they don't send you to prison for gross negligence." He rolled up the window, jammed the shift into drive, and skittered out of the parking lot like a drag racer. About 3 miles down the highway, he was flagged down by a state policeman, who peered casually into the back seat and didn't even bother to make Loomis open the trunk. Loomis shook his head sadly and roared away from the roadblock, steering the nose of his car toward Haddonfield. After an hour, he came to a sign announcing Haddonfield 73 miles.
beside which was a telephone booth. Just beyond it, a red pickup truck was parked. The door of the dilapidated vehicle was open, but Loomis could not see anyone. Loomis frowned and pulled over to kill several birds with one stone. He had to phone his wife, he had to take a leak, and he wanted to look at the truck with the open door. In order of least importance, he called his wife. "No," he said a few familiar homilies. "Not since Thursday. Yes, I'm all right. Stop worrying. After this, I'll sleep for a week, 2 weeks. But for now, I must stop him." "Of course, it's possible," he replied to a conjecture as fatuous as some of Wynn's. "But I know him, and when he gets there, God help us." He gave her some more time-wasting assurances, drumming his fingers impatiently on the coin box. Then, as he was about to ring off, he said, "Oh, listen, dear. When they come around trick-or-treating tonight, why don't you just not answer the door? I know it's ridiculous, but just this once." He hung up and walked to a mound of high grass, hidden from the road, and relieved his burdened bladder. Then went over to the truck to examine it. Perhaps it was merely one abandoned months ago. On the other hand, on the seat lay a newspaper. Loomis pulled it out and looked at the date. October 30th, 1978. Yesterday's paper. He was about to return it to the seat when he noticed a crushed cigarette pack and a pack of matches half obscured by the dirt at his feet. He stopped to pick them up and read the message on the matchbook with fear clawing at his heart. The Rabbit in Red Lounge. Entertainment nightly. He raced back to the car, jumped in, started it, and rooster-tailed back onto the highway. About 6 paces beyond where he had urinated, a man lay in the grass. Except for his shorts, he was naked. His eyes stared in sightless horror at the clouds that had begun to roll in the sky. His body, however, lay stomach downward. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been the very exciting chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Curtis Richards' novelization of the original Halloween. So what did you guys think of tonight's chapters? Did you enjoy that first chapter with Michael escaping the sanitarium? I really enjoyed narrating that chapter. It was nice to get an introduction to Lori in tonight's upload and get a little bit of her inner monologue going in the story. That was nice. And an answer I was curious about was given to me tonight, and that was, we are going to get some of Michael's inner monologue in his scenes in this book. You know, he was going upstairs and thinking about the night he had killed his sister. And if that's an indication of how the scenes are going to be playing out later in the book, then that really has me excited for this book, because getting some of Michael's inner monologues and thoughts is something that you just can't get in the movies. I mean, you can kind of get a little bit when he tilts his head or the way he looks or whatever, but this book is hopefully going to really get us into his psyche. Other than that, you know, I thought the whole stalking thing was great. Him watching them at the window, you know, all they had to do was turn around and they could have seen him there. It's just creepy. And, of course, Dr. Loomis realizing where Michael's heading. You know, I can really feel the intensity in those scenes, and I can feel Loomis's need to hurry up and get there to try to stop what he knows is going to happen if he doesn't get there. And, you know, of course, his dismay whenever he realizes the cops aren't even fully searching vehicles. That's pretty messed up. But that sounds about right in today's, even in 78, but even today, you know, it sounds like something that would happen. Go on. Just laziness. Either that or they're just not taking it seriously enough, and that's got Loomis pissed off. So yeah, guys, we got to see another one of Michael's kills.
or hear about it anyways. The guy laying in the grass with his head twisted around. But I thought that was a nice little throwback, the foreshadow in chapter 5 tonight, about the rabbit and red entertainment and all that on the matchbook, and then him finding that there. Really enjoyed that. Yeah, I could rattle on forever about this book, but we still got a lot of the book to go. So I'm going to end it here, guys. You know how I feel about the book. Please let me know in the comment section what you think of the book so far, what you thought of tonight's chapters, and I'll be back very soon with more of Halloween by Curtis Richards. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and tonight is the night he went to bed. Good night, everybody. See you next time.